I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common sense and common good meet. NatCon Squad is brought to you by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Please subscribe everywhere you can, iTunes, all the other places that probably dislike us, Spotify, YouTube, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. And also, I should say, if you like this podcast, please do consider coming out to NatCon 2, the National Conservatism Conference, upcoming in Orlando, Florida, one of the last bastions of freedom. It'll be October 31st through November 2nd, and we'd love to see you there. All right, well, we've got a jam-packed episode for you today. First, Emily's going to kick us off discussing some of the culture war, hidden culture war items in the infrastructure bill. Rachel will talk about the House GOP's break from the Chamber of Commerce, potential break. I'll talk a little bit about the FBI being sicked on parents who oppose critical race theory. And then lastly, Josh will talk about New Zealand giving up on COVID-0. So with that, we'll turn it over to Emily.
Thanks, Ben. This is an important topic that we touched on last week, but really cannot talk about enough. The infrastructure bill, the reconciliation bill that is being proposed by President Biden, supported by Bernie Sanders, and just about all of the Democratic establishment. This is another point that it cannot be overstated. The Democratic establishment has sided with Bernie Sanders on its entire legislative agenda under Joe Biden. The Build Back Better agenda is right now at $3.5 trillion. It could go as low as $2 trillion if Joe Biden makes that compromise with Joe Manchin. I doubt if it gets down to $2 million, it'll actually fly with Justice Democrats and some other folks on the left. But the bottom line is, even if some of these programs are scaled back in the final bill, even if the bill doesn't pass, and I'm sorry, I said billion, I meant trillion. It's hard to even conceive of these numbers. But even if the bill doesn't pass, and even if some of the programs get scaled back in a smaller version of the bill, what this bill does is radical. It is the Bernie Sanders agenda, with the exception of perhaps Medicare for all. It has 2 years of free community college. It has universal pre-K. It has federal family leave. In the biggest item in here, it also has a civilian climate corps, sort of a throwback to the New Deal. And that's one of the under-discussed kind of culture war things in the bill. But it also, the most important culture war thing it has is essentially universal basic income. No conservatives or Republicans should be talking about the, quote, expanded child tax credit in this bill as an expanded child tax credit. This is UBI for parents. And I fully understand why some conservatives support that in 2021. I fully get it. But that's what's being proposed here. This is no strings attached, monthly federal income for parents, not means tested. It is conditioning parents to look to the federal government on a monthly basis for their needs for their children. And as the Washington Free Beacon reported in an excellent piece by Joe Simonson yesterday, illegal immigrants will also, of course, be eligible for this $250 to $300 a month benefit. So all of these things combined, this is a culture war bill. This is not a conversation that we're having about spending. Right now, I don't need to talk about the debt or the deficit to say that this is a very radical piece of legislation. And again, fully understand. And I generally support an expanded child tax credit, an actually expanded child tax credit. Money without strings to all parents, including illegal immigrants, is a dramatic expansion of the federal government, as is universal pre-K. And let's not forget that all of these things will be given with strings attached eventually. We live in the era where OSHA is enforcing a vaccine mandate. So if you think you're going to get monthly payments from the federal government, even if at first they come without strings attached, for long, it's just not going to happen. Democrats soon enough will start putting cultural conditions to accepting that money. So this is a very radical piece of legislation. It's basically Bernie Sanders' Christmas list with the exception of Medicare for all. And with that, I will toss it open to the group for discussion.
I mean, every issue is a culture war issue now at this point. Democrats have decided they made an infrastructure bill a culture war issue because they infused roads and bridges and bike lanes with gender ideology. I mean, this is not a joke. Like
human infrastructure.
Yeah, but human infrastructure, right?
That's what they say.
Yeah, so this is something that I think like the right needs to be prepared for. But I always come back to my thesis on all of this, which is, everything gets jammed into this bill because Congress doesn't legislate. Like, this is how we do everything now. The culture war gets pushed into spending, gets pushed into infrastructure, gets, everything gets cobbled together because you get one shot at everything, because we can't have debate, we can't have an amendment process, we can't have a normal style legislature that actually considers issues one at a time with full deliberation. So it's amazing to me how the left has shifted toward the Sanders agenda. Biden has basically, conceded all these things to the progressives, Biden the moderate. So I just think it's worth noting the Hyde Amendment is also at issue in this reconciliation bill as well. And that is obviously the part of law that prohibits federal funding from going toward paying for abortion. You see that now wanting to be stripped from the reconciliation bill, and progressives pushing that. So there is no distinction anymore between the fiscal fight and the culture fight. It's just everything is a foundational worldview fight. And unfortunately, that's the world we live in now. The legislative world we live in.
Rachel, to your point, Republicans and Trump kind of did the same thing with Section 230, didn't they? They kind of snuck it in the NDAA towards the end of Trump's second term, if I recall here. So I don't know. I mean, it's not like Democrats necessarily any worse or better than Republicans on this, but I agree. I mean, like crisis, your governance by crisis, obviously, is kind of the way that it's been in Washington, D.C. for decades now. The timing of this UBI thing is actually really funny for me personally. We're recording this on Tuesday. I got back a few hours ago from a talk I was giving last night in Oklahoma. And after the talk was over, I was talking to the sponsoring faculty member literally about UBI. We got into like a 30-minute discussion about this. Look, the thing about UBI, it's interesting. I mean, if you go back, Milton Friedman theoretically supported it, right? And we're not necessarily kind of like doctrinaire 3 cheers for capitalism, Friedmanite boosters on this show. But even from that kind of perspective here, the underlying rationale for UBI, when folks like Friedman, maybe even Hayek, I can't remember if he endorsed it, honestly.
Charles Murray as well.
Right, but like the implicit quid pro quo for the free marketeer types who support UBI is that we do that in lieu of like fully gutting the welfare state, and like doing so by a constitutional amendment. So it can't just like come back in zombie form under the next presidential administration here. So not going to happen, to put it mildly here. So the so-called conservative case for UBI, which may or may not exist on like an academic chalkboard setting, just really doesn't exist in pragmatic reality here. I don't have a whole lot else to add. I think Rachel and Emily basically covered it here. I mean, look, the Democratic Party, like what you see is what you get nowadays. Okay. I mean, I've written this column, like I feel like a million times. It obviously is like the AOC squad, Bernie Sanders, Soviet Union honeymooning, Fidel Castro worshiping tail that is wagging the dog at this point. I mean, if you don't wake up and you don't see that very clearly, then you're frankly just not paying attention at this point, honestly.
Yeah, so I'll just say briefly that I told you so. In March 2020, I wrote an article. I think the original title was something like "Don't Believe the Myth of Moderate Joe Biden." And I had a line in there, "Don't let the Democrat establishment fool you. It's increasingly Bernie Sanders' party, just with superficially less radical frontmen." And I also wrote a book on Ilhan Omar, American Ingrate. And the entire thesis of the book was Ilhan Omar isn't an extreme minority in the Democratic Party. This is the future, if not the present, of the party. The progressivism, the most radical form of progressivism, is where all the animating energy is. It's where the power increasingly will be. And of course, there's the cynical aspect of the Democrat establishment glomming on to the progressives and sort of basking in the glow of the sort of radical chic of the party. But I think the bottom line is this is who the Democratic Party is, as Josh noted. And more broadly, though, I think on the conservative side, we should also look at how the progressives took over one party of the United States. And maybe there's something to be learned from that kind of insurgent example for national conservatives as well. Because if you just look at the numbers, when Bernie Sanders started the Congressional Progressive Caucus, it was like 4 or 5 people in 1994. And now it's almost a majority of the members of the House majority, Democrat majority. So perhaps there is something that we can take away, and that's how does a small perceived fringe minority end up overtaking a major political party? That's the legacy really of Bernie Sanders over the last 30 years. And we should take some lessons away from that.
Yeah. Awesome.
I think that's a good point. Before I transition to myself, I'll just add that like there's a lot of comparisons lately, or at least some comparisons between what, the House Freedom Caucus and the Progressive Caucus and the tactics that they've been taking, which I think have been pioneered, by the House Freedom Caucus. But it's worth pointing out that progressives make up a much larger portion of the Democratic Party than conservatives make up of the Republican Party. And so I think, to your point, there is something that we can do better here in that respect. But I wanted to touch on an issue that's somewhat related to this. And this is, the ongoing negotiations that the Republican leadership has been having about this reconciliation bill. Now, it is not unusual for Republican leadership to, sort of bring in outside actors to have sort of a coalition negotiation about, bills that impact their membership. And in this case, I'm referring specifically to the Chamber of Commerce. And they were involved in strategy calls with the Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy's office, about the reconciliation bill. Now, it was reported yesterday that the Republican leader or some group of members kicked the Chamber of Commerce out of those strategy sessions. And there's a lot of sort of cheering on the right that like, oh, this is a really good sign, especially among the new right, that has been pushing for a more sort of worker-centric, small business-centric style of policymaking and governance. And we know the Chamber of Commerce represents, some of the biggest corporations in the world. These aren't necessarily American corporations, they're multinationals. And they very explicitly lobby in favor of, cheap foreign labor, explicitly just tax cuts, things like that. But the reason I want to raise it is because it boggles my mind. And I think it speaks to the fact that the Republican Party learns nothing, the fact that the Chamber of Commerce was in the room anyway. I was making a brief list before this podcast of everything that the Chamber's been involved in for years, right, that should have barred them from the room specifically. So obviously, recently in 2020, they endorsed 23 Democrats for office, who then went on to vote for all of these radical policies that Chamber of Commerce says they oppose. They famously endorsed Neera Tanden for OMB. Their scorecard now includes measures for bipartisanship and leadership, which has the hilarious result of the fact that Kevin Brady, who's a Republican from Texas, who literally wrote the 2017 tax cuts, now has a lower score than a neighboring House Democrat because he is not bipartisan enough. They came out in support for the Equality Act. They're completely bought in for diversity inclusion initiatives. And, this is known. And I go back all the way to 2009 when my boss here at CPI, Jim DeMitt, wrote an op-ed pointing out that Barack Obama had a higher Chamber of Commerce score than he did in the Senate in 2009. Okay. And that is because Jim DeMint did not vote for the bailouts. All right. So the Chamber of Commerce has never been in the interest of Republicans, and yet we continue. In fact, they work against our political interest in so many areas to the tune of endorsing Democrats, and yet we continue to let them in the tent. We continue to bring them into our strategy sessions. And this to me is like the stupid party, like when are we going to learn that, why would you invite the enemy to your doorstep? So I am hopeful that this signifies a break. I do think the Chamber of Commerce is moving towards the Democrats, but Republicans didn't kick them out, right? They were forced into it because of, the Chamber going so far left. So I don't know, I'd open it up. That's my rant on the Chamber of Commerce. I don't look at this as a big step forward for the Republican Party. It's like, yeah, you should have done it 10 years ago.
I'll just kind of speak and kind of formulate my thoughts in real time here, because I agree with Rachel. Obviously, this is years overdue. The Chamber of Commerce has supported like a far left social agenda for years and years. I'm sure they support repeal of the Hyde Amendment to go along with the Equality Act. And obviously, just like the corporate bailouts, the subsidies, obviously, we kind of go into the Ex-Im Bank. And, I know there are some segments of the so-called new right that are more sympathetic to kind of the old Export-Import Bank, maybe than some of us who've been around the scene a little longer. I still view it a little skeptically, at least myself. But look, the Chamber of Commerce has not been aligned with substantive conservatism for a long time now. They basically, so I can think of like one policy, right, that like probably the four of us would like unanimously agree with the Chamber of Commerce, which is that taxation is generally not a good thing. Okay, but right. Beyond that, when you get into like the details, even the details about what the tax code would look like, obviously, we're not going to be in a whole lot of agreement here, and especially now in a post-COVID environment here, where, after last March and last April with the PPE and the medical supplies, and where there's kind of like a renewed interest maybe in reshoring some semiconductors and supply chain, the Chamber of Commerce is going to manifestly oppose all of that stuff. They are obviously kind of free trade absolutists, even with the Chinese Communist Party, where the notion of so-called quote unquote free trade is a misnomer and it is not a reality, except in some like dorky economist chalkboard settings, right? The Chamber of Commerce at this point, I think probably is just manifestly opposed to our interests. conservatorists, especially here in like national conservatism circles. I mean, query whether, Cato would agree with us, but obviously we're not Cato. So like at this point, from our perspective, like a NatCon squad perspective here, this is like an unambiguously good thing. I agree with Rachel. It's years overdue, and we'll see what happens with it here. But I don't know. I mean, I'll be curious to see what the Wall Street Journal editorial board has to say about it, unless they've written on it already and I missed it.
I mean, it depends on where your priorities are. And I think a lot of Republicans were prioritizing that question about taxation and I can't believe, I hope there's not disagreement over the Ex-Im Bank. I'm shocked to hear this among the new right. This is so, Tim Carney will be so displeased.
Yeah, Michael Lind has like written in favor of it at like American Compass and Tablet, and he's pretty influential in a lot of new right thinking. And that's kind of where I was going with that.
Totally. That's really interesting. I didn't know that. But again, like that's why these conversations are so dynamic right now and so interesting. But I think it's a matter of where Republicans' priorities used to lie, and Republicans were blind to the salience of the cultural issues and the severity of the left's cultural bulldozing and cultural takeover until like after Donald Trump was elected, not even during the primary. I would say like not even his first year in office. I mean, it really took Republicans a while, for some people, not even until the CRT fight, to say, what do we prioritize? Do we prioritize these pro-business interests, or do we prioritize families? Do we prioritize patriotism? Do we prioritize a healthy cultural ecosystem? And the answer to Rachel's point should have always been that we prioritize our culture over our bank accounts. And it's not to say those two things aren't interconnected, but Republicans were resting on their laurels for way too long, totally blind to what was happening beneath their noses in the culture. And it was inexcusable, and blind to the way these two things work together, blind to the way the business's interests were also being used to advance the left's cultural interests. And, that is, to Rachel's point, again, why this relationship never should have been cozy. And I love thinking back, as Rachel just took us to the days of the recession and the way Republicans handled that. And it was like they needed the Tea Party kick in the pants to even talk a good game about fiscal conservatism at that point after the Bush years. And so this relationship, has it ever really made sense? No, but the Republican Party was, I think, sadly co-opted by powerful interests because some of our ideology aligned, but our priorities never should have aligned.
I think your point was really well stated, Emily, about culture versus economics, particularly when the economics ended up underwriting, subsidizing an anti-American culture in effect, and also prioritizing our worst adversaries, namely China, over the American people. And of course, economic liberty has to flow from a culture of liberty. I mean, a perfect example of that is China itself. You have trade with China. It did not turn communist China into a free market bastion. Of course, it just took the benefits of the trade and used it to empower itself ever further. And at core, really what it comes down to is, who cares about marginal tax rates if you don't have a country anymore? And the argument is as simple as that. And of course, Republicans for far too long have ignored that argument. And that leads me to kind of wondering, is this sort of cynical politics in the sense of Republicans are going to kind of play hard to get now with the Chamber of Commerce to then try to ultimately drum up future support from the chamber? Or is there really going to be a break between big business and the Republican Party writ large? And if that does happen, I would say that's not only a positive thing, but it'll also be interesting to see then where do establishment Republicans go for support? If their bread is no longer buttered by establishment, S&P 500 company executives and the like. I mean, their constituency should be non-progressive, common sense Americans, but of course, they've typically gone where the money is. And with an ever shrinking middle class of Americans, as a consequence of the progressive policies that are dominating, it'll be curious to see where they go ultimately for their support. So I question, is this about politics or ideology or both? And if so, what's the upshot of it down the road? And maybe that's something we'll explore over time.
So just real quick, and then I'll toss it back to Ben for our third segment here. The issue personally that I will be looking at when we're talking about like the mid to long-term effect of this chamber divorce that may or may not actually be a thing is antitrust, which obviously is an issue that we've talked about on this show. You know, Rachel has been among the tips of the spear here in trying to kind of forge a realignment inspired approach to antitrust. So we'll see, obviously. I mean, like, those bills have not been signed into law yet, to put it mildly here. But obviously, I think there's a lot of intellectual tension within the right of center fold right now, as far as Lena Khan and Cantor and all the various FTC and DOJ antitrust folks. So that is where I will be looking right now, because, you know, just kind of state the obvious here, the Chamber of Commerce is not exactly on board with a lot of us who are pushing for a kind of more hands-on approach to antitrust, especially vis-a-vis big tech. But anyway, on that note, Ben, let's go back to you.
Sure. Well, one of the themes that I've been kind of pounding the table on this show is the war on wrongthink, the criminalization of dissenters in this country. And I've drawn a straight line from the acceleration of that war on wrongthink from January 6th to today. And we've seen it, of course, in terrorism bulletins targeting those who question the integrity of the 2020 election, those who question draconian Chinese coronavirus policies, of course, usurpation of our rights, liberties, suspensions of them for arbitrary and capricious reasons for months on end, and the like. And now, finally, that war on wrongthink has come for dissenting parents. Now, last week, the National School Boards Association, which represents, I think, about 90,000 school board members at something like 14,000 public school jurisdictions across the country, came out with a letter where they essentially said, and I can actually read directly from it, coupled with attacks against school board members and educators for approving policies for masks to protect the health and safety of students and school employees, questionable. Many public school officials are also facing physical threats because of propaganda purporting the false inclusion of critical race theory within classroom instruction and curricula, also beyond questionable. As these acts of malice, violence, and threats against public school officials have increased, the classification of these heinous actions could be equivalent to a form of domestic terrorism and hate crimes. And then the NSBA went on to call on the Department of Justice and other agencies as well to examine appropriate enforceable actions against these crimes and acts of violence under, among other laws, the Patriot Act in regards to domestic terrorism. So use the Patriot Act against parents who question critical race theory in public schools. And the Department of Justice sprung into action because last night, the night before we recorded this show, and we're recording on a Wednesday, Chris Rufo popularized this letter with a tweet from the Department of Justice and specifically from Attorney General Merrick Garland, which read in part, the department takes these incidents seriously and is committed to using its authority and resources to discourage these threats, identify them when they occur, and prosecute them when appropriate. In the coming days, the department will announce a series of measures designed to address the rise in criminal conduct directed towards school personnel. And he goes on to direct the FBI to work with state and local authorities to pursue these threats with open, dedicated lines of communication for threat reporting, assessment, and response. Even going beyond the weaponization, the use of January 6th to smear, target, demonize half the country, the tens of millions of people who supported President Trump and beyond, just non-progressives more broadly. You can even draw a straight line really from the IRS looking into the activities of Tea Party groups as sort of the start of this long march now to the point where parents who dare to challenge CRT, what I would describe as racial Marxism, as potentially being domestic violent extremists, terrorists. And this NSBA article cites basically heated confrontations at a handful of school board meetings and the like. But the notion that you're going to sic the FBI on school board meetings, on parents who dare to question the orthodoxy of critical race theory is beyond the pale. So what are kind of the big takeaways as I see it at this point? And we should note, by the way, and maybe we can insert some clips after we're done recording this episode of Josh Hawley questioning Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco about this. And Hawley asked some really pointed questions, including like, has the FBI ever been sicked on school boards before for any reason over any particular issue? And of course, Monaco did not have an answer to that. She said essentially, that's not what we're doing. No, we haven't done that, et cetera. She caught herself realizing she might be caught in a lie, I think, there in terms of that's not what we're doing. But more broadly, what is this about? Essentially, the ruling class wants to have control in terms of indoctrinating your children into the regime's ideology. They want to have control over what you put in your body in terms of vaccines, of course. They want to have control over the content of your speech via censorship, via big tech platforms, and claiming that any dissenting opinion is misinformation or disinformation, potentially dangerous, and thus it ought to be shut down. Of course, they want to have control over the narrative around elections that they've usurped unprecedented control over in this post-pandemic era. Ultimately, the conclusion I come to is, how is this anything but totalitarian at this point? They want control over every aspect of our life, and they want to chill any dissenters from that orthodoxy and criminalize them. And it's worth noting, by the way, I don't think a lot of people have pointed this out, that in this National School Board Association letter, they talk about the fact that there's an interstate commerce element at play here, that it's sort of intimidation and violence with an interstate commerce flavor to it. And I think that that is directly pointed at law enforcement and potentially ultimately about, well, why wouldn't they investigate any of the people, individuals, groups who are funding anti-CRT legislation, lobbying, et cetera, the leaders of these organizations and beyond? I think it's squarely pointed at chilling, threatening, intimidating dissenters. And I don't think we can see it any other way. And this has crossed a new Rubicon when we're talking about parents and the content of their kids' education. So I think we've crossed a dangerous, new, disturbing Rubicon, and the slippery slope, it just increases the way that we're accelerating down it. That's how I see it. I'm curious as to your takeaways.
I think it's kind of amazing. This is my only takeaway. Well, I mean, there's many takeaways. I'm going to let you all take the smarter ones, but my only takeaway is that literally the FBI, there was just how many hearings in Congress over the fact that the FBI did not investigate known sexual predation of gymnasts. Let it go on for years, but this is what they're going to spend their time on. They're going to go, arrest parents speaking their minds in school boards. Like this is why we live in clown world, people. This is legitimately clown world. I don't know what else to say. I'm open for your smarter takes.
I would just say, like, what was interesting to me about the letter is it's premised on this idea that there's mass intimidation of school board members around the country, and a sort of organized campaign that is on the level of domestic terrorism. And that is not a premise that the left has proven whatsoever. And it is not a premise that we should cede to them whatsoever, because it is another step in their organized campaign to participate in definition inflation when it comes to domestic terrorism. And so to the extent that they are trying to paint what is a very widespread campaign against critical race theory and excessive COVID policies around the country at school board meetings as domestic terrorism, they cannot meet the burden of proof. They can they can do what Beckett Adams calls nut picking and haul out some crazy people in a few corners of the country. They cannot prove anywhere near the fact that this is a widespread campaign. They tried to do it with Independent Women's Forum last week, where they accused IWF because Hadley Heath Manning had posted a template of a letter she sent to her own school for other moms to use. I mean, just like the most innocuous thing in the world. The Washington Post wrote a whole story about how it was some shadowy Koch brothers campaign to influence and to sort of like intimidate school boards with disinformation. It was unbelievable, but that's how bad it is. That's how weak they are at making this case and of meeting the burden of proof. And so I think that is extremely important to just look at how reality differs from the reality that the media and the left, which controls the media, tells us that we live in. We don't live in that world, but they have so much control over our self-perception that they are influencing a lot of people to think that they do, including the surveillance state.
So one quick point, then I want to read a quick excerpt. So when Ben uses the phrase interstate commerce, my lawyerly ears immediately perk up, because that's basically language right out of the Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8. So I hear that language, and the first thing that I think of is like, wow, they're teeing this up potentially not for some sort of executive branch action with DOJ or Merrick Garland or anything like that. They might be going for like full scale, like congressional, like straight up regulation as well here. So let's just put that on the back burner for now and kind of just hold on that, and we'll see what happens in a week or two. The excerpt that I want to read is from an op-ed that, as of our recording, has not been published yet, but by the time it comes out will have been published. It's not bad. I'm running a Newsweek this week from my friend Max Eden of the American Enterprise Institute, who has a great op-ed on this exact subject here. So I just want to briefly quote Max's op-ed here. So Max he quotes the NSBA letter. The letter argues, quote, acts of malice, violence, and threats against public school officials have increased. But then Max actually goes to the source, and he cites what the incidents that NSBA is relying upon as these alleged violence and threats actually are. So on the one hand, someone in Alabama made some prank calls. A resident in Alabama who proclaimed himself as vaccine police called school administrators while filming himself on Facebook Live. Second, someone else in Michigan, quote, prompted the school board to call a recess because of opposition to critical race theory. How nefarious. Third, parents in several states have loudly protested mask mandates, which disrupted school board meetings. Finally, other groups, specifically Turning Point USA, are, quote, spreading misinformation that boards are adopting critical race theory curricula and working to maintain online learning by haphazardly attributing it to COVID-19. So that is literally the alleged substantive underlying incidents that have led to this letter. So just want to throw that out there, bear that in mind here, because this is just Looney Tune stuff, honestly.
Yeah, let me just put a capper on it by saying this is the ultimate in projection. It's good that Max Eden went to the specific examples cited in the NSBA letter. It's worth noting that the DOJ letter did not cite any particular threats, as is their wont. They like to be as nebulous and vague as they can, it seems, in all manner of issues like this. But then obviously, of course, there's the sheer hypocrisy here, which doesn't matter to the left. And it sort of shows that the gloves are off because there will never be any intellectually honest engagement on this. But the left dominates when it comes to using violence to intimidate people into their positions. I mean, we just saw the George Floyd riots last summer, of course, across the country, which were all about intimidating people to support the worldview of the left. And then where was the DOJ there? So it's a joke. It's very clear that the gloves are completely off. They want power at any and every cost. They're willing to classify potentially more than half the country as actual or would-be terrorists or insurrectionist sympathizers or the like. And we have to call it out for what it is. It's never really about the substance of what the threat is. The threat at the end of the day is anyone who dares dissent from their orthodoxy.
So I think it's actually a perfectly fine transition of dissenting from orthodoxy and deviating from orthodoxy. And of course, the orthodoxy that we're going to talk about in the final segment here is COVID hysteria and lockdowns and social distancing and all that terrible stuff that's been with us for a year and a half now. So I want to talk a little bit about New Zealand, which is perhaps the first time that New Zealand has been mentioned on this show, but it's worth discussing here because from basically day one, New Zealand was kind of one of the foremost proponents of just very aggressive, some I would say draconian restrictions on lockdowns, masking, social distancing, the whole works, the whole repertoire of the kind of leftist pro-COVID hysteria playbook, so to speak. One of my group chats, I remember as recently as like last March or April, we were kind of mocking New Zealand as Fortress Kiwi. I mean, they're literally like an island nation, obviously, and they were like basically keeping the people in. You couldn't leave, foreigners couldn't go in, just really kind of heavy-handed draconian stuff. So what happened earlier this week, over the weekend, or at least by Monday at the latest here, is New Zealand gave up. They gave up on COVID zero, which obviously was the policy they were pursuing here. And what we mean by COVID zero, of course, just to kind of drill home the point, is a policy of lockdowns, et cetera, in perpetuity until you actually reach zero COVID. But earlier this week, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, has formally acknowledged that they are no longer pursuing COVID zero here. So here's the quote, "We're transitioning from our current strategy into a new way of doing things. With the Delta variant, the return to zero is incredibly difficult, and our restrictions alone are not enough to achieve that quickly. In fact, for this outbreak, it's clear that long periods of heavy restrictions has not got us to zero cases." So I guess the prime minister, I would say, well, welcome to what, a myriad other countries have now demonstrated time and time again for well over a year now, that the social science correlation between draconian lockdown policies and COVID transmissions and death rates and all of that is extremely low. But it does seem like we're slowly potentially reaching an inflection point. You know, a lot of us obviously on this show, a lot of us kind of live in the right-wing Twitter sphere, so take with a grain of salt. But at least kind of like from my perspective and probably y'all's perspective too here, what's going on in Australia, neighboring New Zealand, does seem to be generating a lot of attention here. I mean, our friend Jordan Schachtel has been going on and on about the way that the government is treating the unvaccinated population there with what can only be described as really totalitarian, borderline fascist, honestly, measures, kind of just ostracizing into the vaccinated and the unvaccinated in just truly just awful fashion. But for the country of New Zealand, which again has kind of been the forefront here, kind of like been leading the charge of this kind of aggressive lockdown policy with the conscientious societal goal of reaching COVID zero, for them to repudiate this and backtrack does seem like a big inflection point here. And it's just briefly worth just reminding the viewers and listeners, because we are so far removed now from March 2020. The initial lockdown policies, 15 days to slow the spread, you know, as was infamously called, was literally about one metric. It wasn't about reaching COVID zero. It wasn't about transmission. It wasn't about death. It wasn't about anything other than hospital capacity overload. That was literally the only metric that the implied quid pro quo for the American people to kind of shut up, lock down, put on the face diapers and all that stuff. That was what it was predicated upon, was hospital capacity overload. So just the constant goal shifting here has been incredible. And it does seem like a big deal, at least to me, for New Zealand of all countries to start to acknowledge this. Ben, I guess I'll toss it to you first, and then obviously the rest of it, because you had a great piece for me in Newsweek on this recently, where you referred to COVID as kind of the Afghanistan of pandemics, kind of getting along these goalpost shifting lines here. So I'd be curious if you agree with me that the New Zealand news is a semi-big to just frankly just big deal.
Yeah, well, the policy of 2 weeks to flatten the curve and then 2 years to subdue a country completely and usurp as much power as you possibly can has been proceeding at record speed here. So I do find it heartening that New Zealand has given up on a farcical, disastrous policy. You know, from the start, when I was writing about coronavirus, you know, my fear up front was, look, are the measures that are going to be taken to quote unquote fight this pandemic ultimately going to prove far more costly than alternative measures? And it was never really presented that way. The binary was ever, you know, according to the Imperial College model that we all remember, millions of people are going to die, or we shut everything down, even though we've never really done that in the history of mankind before. And as we've seen, obviously, first of all, there's very good analysis out there from John Tierney at City Journal, for example, to suggest that there are unaccounted for tens of thousands of excess deaths that occurred having nothing to do with the coronavirus over the last year, that occurred among populations that were not disproportionately affected by the coronavirus, like younger, healthier populations of people. Obviously, we've had the suspension of our liberties for months on end, and of course, favoring of the liberties of some people over others in this country under these policies. I'm referring there to rioters can go out and do whatever they want during the summer of 2020, and you can't go to church or congregate with your friends and the like. And then obviously, of course, there's the knock-on effects for the election policies, in which, in violation of law, you know, letting governors set up election rules without the legislative branch, and on and on. We don't need to go through the litany of items. The question that I have, I guess, is what would entice our lawmakers to finally relent and treat this like we treat other diseases, as opposed to something that will prove catastrophic and that requires what I've termed kind of a forever pandemic, a perpetual pandemic footing. If we're looking at this from the optimistic side, you know, leaving aside the waning efficacy, it appears, of the vaccines, and then, of course, you know, on the other side of the ledger, the fact that it appears that finally one antiviral pill has been developed that, you know, may serve as some kind of wonder drug here. I noticed that Scott Gottlieb recently, the former head of the FDA, and someone who, you know, is ensconced in the pharma community, a board member at Pfizer and elsewhere, recently said that he thinks this will become endemic by the fourth quarter of the year. And that's interesting, coming from someone who's kind of taken the more draconian side in terms of lockdowns and restrictions and the like. So if I wanted to take the bullish, optimistic view, I'd say, Yeah, it's good to see New Zealand turning. And the fact that someone like Scott Gottlieb would say that, he probably knows more than we do about where the policies are going, where the pharma companies are going and the like. So maybe we should be hardened by that. But all that said, I think my broader takeaway is I'm demoralized at how easily Americans could be scared into sacrificing their liberties for months and months on end, accepting the censorship, accepting the heavy-handedness of our leaders. And I'm not sure that I've seen the American people stand up and say enough is enough to this point. And of course, then when you have the government casting those who would stand up and say enough is enough as potential domestic extremists, you can understand that they'd be a little bit concerned about doing so.
All I will add is that to see this happening in a Western country is just terrifying. I mean, I don't know too much about the particulars of the politics on the ground, but to see this happening in a country with Western values is seriously a wake-up call for everyone. I know we feel like we have a lot of wake-up calls in the United States these days, but holy smokes, this might be the most glaring red flag that I have seen in a very, very, very long time, if not ever, because we're in such a fragile situation and we continue to have reminders of that. But COVID is the ultimate excuse. We have a good chunk of our population in the United States that has been conditioned to actually crave government interference in their personal lives because of COVID. They want it. We have been conditioned to sort of be weak and reliant on the government. COVID is where Life of Julia has suddenly lived its best life and come to seem comfortable to some people. I'm not saying the whole country, but there is a chunk of the country that has gotten so comfortable with that over the course of the pandemic that this recipe with a pandemic mixed with that and seeing the consequences of it in a Western style country, it's just truly terrifying.
Yeah, I think to add to what Emily said, it's not even just that it's comfortable for people. It's an easy excuse to demonize people they don't like. It provides people an extremely lazy excuse to say, this person, I dislike is evil because of X, and the government's going to enforce that narrative for me. I talk about this all the time with speech controls too. It allows you to become very lazy, and instead of grappling with ideas or perspectives that may be outside your comfort zone, you are given the tools to simply, pretend that they do not exist. So I do think, and it just goes to the reminder that, pluralism, liberalism, however you want to describe it, is difficult. It is hard and it is not guaranteed. And I think we're going to look back on this COVID experiment and one, ask why the world went insane for 2 years, but two, look at it, hopefully from the other side, as an actual test that some countries and some places, I would say in the United States, failed to uphold and maintain, the premises of sort of individual choice, liberty, diversity, pluralism that this country was founded on. And I think that's a very, very scary concept.
Yeah, it's
go ahead, Josh.
No, go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say really briefly, we've talked about this before, but this should have discredited so many different people, the leaders who took the most heavy-handed, destructive policies, those who covered up lab leak, those who flipped on any number of issues from 2 weeks to flatten the curve to perpetual pandemic footing and beyond. And yet, as we've kind of discussed here, there's a craving among millions of Americans, I guess the smart, cultured, vaccinated crowd that just wants more and more heavy-handed control from our technocratic administrative state. So we're really on a precipice here in terms of what kind of country we are and who rules at the end of the day.
Yeah, the very quick point I was going to add, and then we'll kick it over to final thoughts here, is unfortunately a somewhat pessimistic one, which is it's unclear exactly what the path back to sanity will entail here, because once a large swath of the population, and by a large swath of the population, we're talking here a sizable majority, really, of frankly, of what it seems like the American citizenry is just willing to go along like lemmings with what I think Dennis Prager, like in his column every week nowadays, is properly referring to as just a slew of irrational edicts and orders that kind of just seemingly come out of various bureaucrats, rear ends without much forethought. Once you kind of cede that power, it reminds me of kind of, the phrase one-way ratchet, which my former law professor, Richard Epstein, would always use to refer to various things in Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. It's a one-way ratchet. When you give these politicians this power, when you just don't fight back at all when it's like this level of arbitrary and irrational. It's a very long road back there. But anyway, for the sheer sake of time, let's transition here to final thoughts. So who wants to go ahead and start?
So I'll start. Josh and I are on a panel, I think, together at NatCon 2 on what is national conservatism. And I think it's going to be pretty interesting because I think it's going to be fairly diverse viewpoints from myself, you, Julius Krein, and Ryan Williams from Claremont. So I'm looking forward to it. And I think I got to write my speech, but I have some thoughts. So hopefully it'll be articulate and well thought out.
It's really easy, Rachel. All you have to do is read some Lenin and you'll feel really comfortable. Rachel's a socialist, the ongoing joke. In case you've missed it in the past, she's not. But I actually am really looking forward to the conference because I think in my final thoughts, I'll just reflect on how what we're working out in these conversations is the same thing that the first National Conservatism Conference worked out and provided, I think, a clear framework for. I mean, it's easy to sort of for the left to say, well, the right is just spinning its populist wheels. But no, there's actually like very real concrete policy solutions that come out of these conversations. And we just today, this conversation itself sort of proved that. And it's not just policies, but it's priorities and decisions that the conservative movement should make, and the Republican Party, if you're so inclined to try to direct the Republican Party in one way or the other. But that's what, when we're looking back at what we just talked about, everything and how fragile this country is, I kind of look forward to having the conversation about what we value in the United States and then how to preserve what we value. Because as we talked today, that's the thing that stood up in every topic we covered, is there something that we value here? And there has to be a better way to preserve it, or we desperately need to preserve it. So I'm looking forward to that.
Just kind of underscore what Ben said at the very top here. You can go to nationalconservatism.org. The NatCon 2 conference will be October 31st through November 2nd in Orlando, Florida. Rachel, I definitely am looking forward to that panel as well. I have a sneaking suspicion that Ryan is going to come out charging one way or the other. I don't know exactly which way that ultimately cuts, but I definitely look forward to hearing his perspective on how Claremont kind of fits into everything that's currently happening and on the right of center. Julius, I was also on a panel with Julius actually at Johnny Burke's ISI Political Economy Conference in late July. And let me just briefly say that Julius is a hoot to be on a panel with because he truly gives zero you-know-whats. And he is not afraid of making enemies left and right. So it'll be a lot of fun. So hope you guys join us in Orlando.
I'm thrilled. I'm going to be chairing a conversation on the China challenge. And in some ways, this is, from my perspective, the issue, but in other respects, it's sort of so far down the list of the challenges we face, in part because I hope we get to the point of actually confronting China the way we ought to confront it. If we lose essentially all of our values and principles, our freedoms, justice, classically understood, in the next generation, basically, we will lose to China almost definitionally, and they will be the hegemonic world power, and we will be a vassal state. So on the one hand, I think this is the most critical foreign adversary that we face. This is the issue. This is what national security and foreign policy all ought to be directed towards confronting. But on the other hand, we'll never get those policies aligned properly if we forget who we are as a country and we don't agree on a unifying set of principles. So I really look forward to listening to a lot of the conversations among heterodox thinkers that will be at this conference to hash out what are the areas where we all agree, what are the areas of disagreement, what are the compromises that we can make, and not on principle, but in terms of tactically, in order to get along and ultimately save this country, save Western civilization. And on my panel, by the way, I've got Mike Pillsbury, David Goldman, Mike Anton, and Kurt Mills. There should be a lot of really interesting thoughts to come out of it. I want to touch on the immediate challenge with respect to Taiwan and kind of where we all come out on that, national industrial policy. How do we decouple to the extent we can decouple from communist China and all the rest? So I think it'll be a fascinating conversation among many fascinating conversations during that conference. But with that, for Emily, Josh, and Rachel, I'm Ben Weingarten. We'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.